A traveler steps into a caravanserai buried beneath desert dunes, the air thick with the scent of burnt iron and ancient ash. Shadows stretch unnaturally, mirrors reflect faces that are not his own, and every breath tastes like smoke and memory. By the seventh night, he realizes he is no longer walking the desert. He is walking inside the building itself, his soul flickering like heat above coals, tethered to a fire that will never let him go. The first traveler arrived at dusk, when the desert sun bled crimson across the rolling dunes, painting every ridge with fire and shadow. The caravanserai rose from the sand like a jagged wound in the earth, walls blackened with smoke and time, edges crumbling yet stubbornly intact, as though the structure had learned to endure centuries of wind and flame. The air was thick with the scent of burned wood and molten iron, a metallic bitterness that clung to the throat and eyes, and for a moment the traveler thought he could taste ash in the wind. The silence surrounding the building was unnatural, almost violent in its insistence, pressing into the bones with the weight of an unseen hand, empty yet tangible, as if the walls themselves were inhaling and exhaling with deliberate intent. No bird dared trace the sky above, no insect dared stir. The desert seemed suspended, holding its breath, waiting for the intrusion of the living. Footsteps fell onto the ash-coated courtyard, soft but audible, and each step carried a resonance that did not belong, echoing once before fading into an oppressive quiet that mocked the notion of return. The traveler hesitated at the threshold, sensing the architecture as if it were a living entity, walls leaning inward with the patience of predators, doorways framing darkness so absolute that it seemed to absorb the edges of vision. The hinges creaked under the weight of history, a sound that died too quickly, leaving only the memory of a creak as a phantom vibration across the chest. Smoke curled from fissures in the walls, thin and serpentine, carrying with it a faint whisper, a susurration of voices, or perhaps the suggestion of them, brushing against ears without landing, touching the mind without permission. The traveler shivered, though the heat of the desert still clung to his skin, and realized the cold came not from the air, but from the sensation of being observed by a place that had watched generations before him, cataloging arrivals and departures as if life and death were interchangeable. Inside, the corridors stretched narrower than expectation, lined with sarcophagi of bronze and iron, each engraved with names that were unfamiliar yet familiar, like echoes of dreams half remembered. The smell of soot and metal intensified as he stepped further, layered over a subtler, almost imperceptible odor of old incense, and something faintly animal, like the scent of trapped life waiting for release. Shadows moved in the periphery, slipping across walls that were cracked but not damaged, bending corners that should have been straight, as though the building itself manipulated perception. The traveler's reflection appeared in a darkened panel, face pale and drawn, eyes wide with the instinctive knowledge that this place was not made for the living. A sudden draft carried the bitter smoke across his skin, and the sound of his own heartbeat amplified until it was deafening, thudding against ribs like an intruder in a chamber already full of secrets. The traveler pressed forward, compelled by a mixture of fear and curiosity, each step measured, each inhalation deliberate, aware that the floor beneath him might remember him after he left, imprinting traces of presence into layers of ash and dust that no wind could remove. The sun sank fully behind the dunes, leaving the world outside bathed in violet shadow, while within the walls, darkness thickened into something tangible, weighty enough to lean against, to taste, to feel pressing against the lungs. There was no welcome, no invitation, only the slow, deliberate consumption of awareness, as if the building itself had learned to hunger for observation, feeding silently on the living, shaping every nerve and tendon before allowing the body to pass. The traveler understood, without thought, that the caravanserai would not merely host him. It would mark him, leave its signature upon his senses, and somewhere between the heat of the desert and the chill of the shadowed halls, the first threads of transformation had already begun. Inside, the corridors unfolded like the bones of some ancient, buried creature, narrow and unyielding, lined with shelves of bronze sarcophagi whose surfaces were etched with names that belonged to no living memory, as if the centuries themselves had conspired to erase the identities of those interred. The traveler's bare feet pressed against floors coated in soft ash, each step sinking just enough to leave a faint trace. Yet the trail vanished almost immediately, smothered by the subtle movements of the building, which seemed to absorb and rewrite every imprint, every disturbance, every signal of life. The air was thick with a mixture of smoke, metallic tang, and an underlying sweetness that reminded the mind of rot and incense simultaneously, and it clung to the lungs, stubborn and insistent, forcing the traveler to pause, to measure the rhythm of breathing, the rise and fall of chest against the invisible resistance of the atmosphere. Faint whispers crawled along the corridors, curling around ankles and wrists like living threads, brushing against skin with invisible fingers, slipping into the ears without ever forming words, forming instead a sensation of presence, of memory displaced, of voices borrowed from some place that existed just beyond comprehension. Eyes burned without discernible cause, stinging and watering as if the air itself were charged with some unseen irritant, yet no smoke or flame could be found within the hallways, only the lingering aftertaste of something long burned, long dead, and somehow still vital. Laughter entered the corridors, though the lips of the traveler moved only in tension, forming no sound. The laughter was wrong, grotesque, stretched and shrunk against the walls, echoing in rhythms that obeyed no logic, folding over itself, splitting into fragments, rebounding and returning as something alive, something that seemed to probe for comprehension, for recognition, for fear. The traveler's own heartbeat became amplified, pounding not just in the chest, but reverberating through the bones, through the thin layer of ash underfoot, up the legs and into the skull, until it felt intrusive, unbearable, an internal echo of the hall's own pulse. Each sarcophagus seemed to possess its own life, subtle yet undeniable. The bronze shimmered with heat unseen, sometimes curling light into patterns that did not match the source, shapes that hinted at faces pressed against the metal from within, at mouths opening in silent screams that bent the very space around them. Names written on the lids were carved in scripts foreign and familiar at once, looping and angular, lines intersecting in ways that suggested a meaning never intended for comprehension, and the traveler found himself drawn to read them, to trace the characters with fingers that trembled despite resolve, though no message could be extracted, only the heavy sense of histories contained, and perhaps tortured, over countless decades. Ash shifted beneath movement, curling into miniature dunes that rose and fell with each step, and sometimes the traveler imagined he could see the shapes of small footprints belonging to some unseen animal, or perhaps the residue of those who had wandered here before him, trapped by the smoke, by the building, by its patient, meticulous hunger. The corridors were not silent. They were alive with the noise of absence, the absence of sound that somehow became sound in perception, a hum, a murmur, a low-level insistence that pressed against the ears even when they were closed. Smoke rose from fissures in the walls in thin serpentine streams, curling around corners, brushing against ankles and calves, and carried with it sensations of touch and memory that were impossible to place. The traveler felt things that were not his own, joys, fears, regrets, flashing across the skin like electric sparks, yet all vague and fleeting, impossible to categorize, impossible to reject. The smell of burnt iron became stronger near certain sarcophagi, and when the traveler approached, he felt a tug at the chest, a pressure as if the bronze itself exhaled upon him, and a faint vibration ran through the ash beneath his feet, as though the building's floor responded to his presence, communicating in a language older than the desert itself. Shadows moved in the periphery of vision, always in the corner, never in direct view, shapes that suggested bodies crouched or pressed against walls, bending light and air around them, always leaving a sense of being watched, of something alive and patient, cataloging every movement, every breath, every thought. The traveler's reflection appeared in patches of blackened metal, a face drawn and pale, eyes wide with an instinctive terror that had nothing to do with the desert outside, nothing to do with the sun or sand or wind, but everything to do with the hallways themselves, with the long bronze sarcophagi, with the smoke that seemed to carry memory and expectation in equal measure. Laughter returned, this time closer, emanating not from the walls but from some internal source, echoing off the ribcage and skull, folding inward, twisting around thought, until coherent reasoning became impossible, until the mind turned inward to escape the sound, only to find the echo rebounding within itself. Movement became uncertain. The traveler's arms felt heavy, controlled by impulses that were not entirely his own, guiding hands toward sarcophagi, toward the thin columns of ash, toward spaces that promised revelation and punished curiosity in equal measure. Each step forward seemed to extend time, stretching minutes into something viscous, each heartbeat a drum marking the slow torture of endurance, the awareness that the hallways themselves measured him, calibrated him, set him against something older than memory, older than language. The corridor twisted, impossibly, bending logic as surely as walls, and the traveler felt vertigo, not from height or motion, but from the impossibility of spatial truth, from the sense that the walls, the ash, the smoke, and the sarcophagi were engaged in a choreography that required him to follow, to submit, to endure, until the edges of body and building blurred, until the distinction between self and place was no longer meaningful. Whispers became voices, voices became visions, visions became tactile experiences pressing against flesh, and the traveler could no longer distinguish past from present, external from internal, living from remembered. Breath thickened, lungs constricted, yet the air remained unchanged, as if the corridors themselves had altered perception rather than substance, teaching a slow, inexorable lesson in presence and absence, in life and in smoke, in the ownership of nothing but the body that walked among the sarcophagi, carrying both its own fear and the weight of countless forgotten lives. The traveler continued, compelled beyond reason, every sense absorbed into the hall, until the ash beneath feet became a map of unseen journeys. The bronze sarcophagi seemed to pulse with histories uncounted, and the smoke carried a weight that pressed against thought, memory, and even desire itself. The laughter, grotesque and distorted, followed every movement, coiling into the spine, tickling nerve endings, whispering the secrets of those who had never left. And in that corridor, narrow, endless, and alive, the traveler understood with absolute clarity that this place did not merely house the dead. It housed the continuation of consciousness, a slow, deliberate combustion of identity into something both more and less than human, and that whatever emerged on the other side, if such a side existed, would never be untouched, would never be whole, would never truly belong to the world again. By the seventh night, the corridors had transformed into something beyond comprehension, twisting and folding upon themselves like the coiled ribs of some immense, buried creature. The travelers moved through them cautiously, yet every step seemed preordained, every breath absorbed and catalogued by the air itself, thick with smoke that had grown heavier, richer, almost viscous, carrying scents that were no longer merely burning wood or iron but the subtle, sickly sweetness of something long dead yet insistently alive. Mirrors appeared at intervals along the walls, blackened and warped, their surfaces reflecting not faces but shadows that twisted independently, slipping and sliding in ways that defied logic, as if the act of looking had been rewritten into a new language of absence. Travelers felt their own reflections drift away, dissolving into forms they did not recognize, faces pale and elongated, lips shaping silent words that belonged to someone else entirely, words that carried histories of pain and desire, victories and betrayals that had never touched their lives. Their eyes dulled, pupils fixed in a liminal gaze that observed without understanding, taking in the corridors, the sarcophagi, the creeping smoke, while an internal voice, not their own, whispered patterns of movement and stillness, instructions they could not resist. The floor beneath them, layered with fine ash, seemed to shift subtly, molding itself to each footfall, sinking just enough to register pressure before rebounding, as if the building were alive, breathing, and capable of response, an organism whose purpose was observation, adaptation, and quiet domination. The master appeared then, not as a man, but as a silhouette of inevitability, his presence indicated by the faintest movement of the smoke, curling around him like a cloak, hands darkened with ash and stains that suggested both ritual and carnage. He moved with deliberate precision between the bronze sarcophagi, each motion measured, patient, exacting, inhaling the thickened smoke as though it were sustenance, drawing nourishment from the suspended particles of history, memory, and fear. Every inhalation seemed to pull the building into alignment, as if the master's very breath dictated the rhythm of the corridors, the curvature of walls, the placement of shadows, and the pulse of the ash beneath the travelers' feet. The heartbeat of the air itself could be felt, a low vibration that resonated through ribs and skull, pressing upon nerves with the authority of inevitability, teaching the travelers the measure of their own endurance, the threshold between self and environment, between living and the manipulation of life. As hours unfolded, perception became a malleable substance, each sense stretched and reshaped, each movement a negotiation between intention and compulsion. Smoke curled in thick, deliberate strands, weaving patterns across the corridors, brushing against skin, insinuating itself into hair and clothing, clinging to memory like wet clay, imprinting sensations that were not yet understood, not yet assigned, but already forming an architecture of fear and transformation. The travelers' hands moved without command, touching bronze lids, tracing etched names, feeling grooves that pulsed faintly under fingertips, as if the sarcophagi themselves held vitality, responding to contact with a rhythm synchronized to the heartbeat of the hall. The ash shifted beneath their feet in concentric patterns that seemed to guide them, encouraging steps toward areas of greatest smoke density, toward shadows that flickered with suggestion, toward the silhouette that measured them silently. Laughter, grotesque and irregular, returned at intervals, coiling around ankles, climbing legs, nestling in chests, a sound that existed outside the logic of air, vibrating directly in bones, sometimes mimicking voices, sometimes distorting them beyond recognition, shaping new cadences, teaching the travelers to distinguish rhythm from origin, terror from necessity. Time had lost meaning. Minutes stretched into hours, hours folded into themselves, and the sequence of days evaporated like breath on cold glass. Travelers could no longer recall whether they had slept or merely drifted in a suspended state of awareness, or if the seventh night truly existed or was simply a construct imposed by the corridors and the master, a frame to measure endurance. Every reflection, every shadow, every flicker of smoke reinforced the inevitability of transformation, the surrender of familiar identity to the building and its unseen laws. Lids of sarcophagi seemed to vibrate imperceptibly, as if the spirits contained within responded to the traveler's altered perception, acknowledging recognition without interaction, confirming that consciousness, whether living or dead, was subject to the same meticulous rules. The master moved with fluid precision among them, observing, adjusting, a conductor of invisible forces, inhaling and exhaling not merely for respiration, but to shape the very experience of those under his gaze, a slow, inexorable calibration of mind and body. The travelers began to experience perception in layers, the physical sensation of ash beneath skin, the weight of smoke pressing against lungs, the internal resonance of sound that was not sound but heartbeat, memory, and expectation intertwined, and the flickering reflection in blackened metal that was no longer self, but amalgam of every traveler, every ghost, every history compressed into the corridor itself. Breathing became a deliberate act of negotiation, each inhalation measured against an invisible standard, each exhalation feeding the rhythm of the hall, feeding the master's calculation, until the distinction between self and environment dissolved. Pain, fear, and fatigue arrived in waves, not abrupt but cumulative, saturating nerves until the travelers' bodies learned efficiency under duress, their motions economized, their senses honed to detect every deviation in air, shadow, or ash. By the end of the seventh night, the corridors themselves seemed to pulse with a collective consciousness, the travelers no longer separate entities but extensions of the hall, moved by smoke, ash, shadow, and the presence of the master. The mirrors no longer reflected faces but intentions, thoughts, desires, and fears suspended, displayed as if on a ledger of inevitability. The air vibrated with suppressed laughter, whispers, and heartbeat, teaching endurance, compliance, and the quiet acceptance of transformation. Shadows lengthened and curled along walls in patterns both deliberate and spontaneous, and the silhouette of the master moved between sarcophagi with unwavering patience, inhaling the smoke and exhaling inevitability. Travelers felt themselves simultaneously present and absent, alive and catalogued, knowing that whatever emerged from the corridors would bear the indelible mark of the place, a silent imprint in mind, body, and spirit, shaped and measured by the air, the ash, the bronze, and the patient, tireless figure whose shadow orchestrated the slow transmutation of life into something both more and less than human. Dreams became corridors longer than the desert night, twisting and folding upon themselves in impossible loops that always returned to the smoke-filled hall, so that travelers awoke unsure where the dream ended and the ash-laden corridors began. The line between waking and sleep had dissolved. Each exhalation, each blink, carried the resonance of places not yet reached and horrors only half remembered, lingering in the skin as if etched by invisible hands. Travelers found their bodies inhabited by memories that were not theirs, the deaths of others pressed against ribs and spine, each pulse a footstep across a timeline they had never traversed, voices articulating through their mouths against volition, words they had never known yet spoke with precision, carrying the weight of lives concluded in agony and silence. Hands moved without consent, tracing invisible lines along walls that shifted when unobserved, surfaces curling subtly in response to touch, reacting to the pressure of fingertips like sentient parchment, absorbing and redirecting the intent of the living, recording it in patterns that could be read only by the building itself. Ash swirled beneath their feet, forming miniature dunes that rose and fell with each step, carrying impressions of centuries, pressing against toes and ankles, whispering histories of those who had come before and never left. Every movement became a negotiation with the unseen. Each step forward bore the scrutiny of countless invisible eyes, patient, meticulous, demanding compliance with rules not written, enforced by shadows that seemed to grow heavier in response to hesitation. The corridors bent perceptual truth into unnatural angles, walls curving subtly to draw attention, ceilings dipping to compress the chest, floors rising to unbalance the gait, all orchestrated in silence, as if the building itself were a master of the body's awareness, shaping endurance into ritual. Travelers could feel the air shift around them, thickened with smoke that was no longer mere residue of fire but a medium, a substance that carried weight and intent, clinging to hair, skin, and clothing, imparting a sensation of pressure, of observation, of expectation. Shadows moved independently, flickering at the edges of vision, elongating or shortening with will, never static, always probing, folding into themselves when confronted, returning moments later in new formations that suggested intent, calculation, anticipation. Laughter arose without source, grotesque and distorted, echoing in the corridors with irregular cadences, wrapping around knees, chest, and spine, vibrating through bone, insinuating itself into thought, and teaching the travelers a rhythm beyond comprehension, a cadence of endurance, a measure of transformation. Mirrors, darkened and warped, revealed not reflection but layers of presence, faces overlaid with other faces, eyes that belonged to someone else gazing from within, lips shaping silent mutterings that conveyed histories and secrets not their own. Travelers' own eyes dulled, pupils fixed in a liminal stare that observed without perception, seeing corridors that were impossible, sarcophagi that shifted subtly in form, smoke that pulsed and spiraled with a life of its own. The bronze sarcophagi resonated faintly under touch, pulsing with the memory of those interred, reacting to presence and movement, recording intention, feeding back into the corridor's consciousness. Ash rose in miniature swirls, responding to breath and pressure, wrapping around ankles like spectral coils, tugging at balance and awareness, carrying whispers of names, events, and sensations too ancient and too immediate to categorize. Time was fractured. The sequence of nights and days collapsed into a single, elongated experience that pressed against awareness like a physical weight. Travelers no longer recalled if they had slept, if they had eaten, if they had stepped outside the desert, or if the desert had ever existed beyond this interstitial space of smoke, ash, and shadow. Movement became ritualized, hands tracing patterns along walls that resisted comprehension, mapping invisible lines that led to no destination but demanded precision, guided by some intelligence resident in the corridors themselves. Each breath felt observed, measured, recorded, as though inhalation and exhalation were acts of consequence, shaping endurance, shaping identity, shaping the capacity to survive in a place that did not merely contain bodies but redefined them. The Master's silhouette appeared intermittently in the corridors, never approaching but always perceptible, a shadow that moved in perfect synchrony with the smoke and ash, inhaling and exhaling in a rhythm that set the pace of the corridors, a conductor of perception whose patience was infinite, whose attention was absolute. Travelers became aware that their thoughts, fears, and impulses were subject to the same careful measurement, that internal responses were observed and guided with subtle insistence, and that surrender was not a matter of choice but inevitability, enforced not by force but by circumstance, by design, by the orchestration of environment and perception. By the end of the extended night, travelers felt their bodies both alien and intimately known, limbs guided by unseen authority, hearts pulsing in alignment with the corridor's rhythm, senses attuned to smoke, ash, and shadow, and mouths forming words unspoken, voices carrying the resonance of histories not their own. The corridors themselves had become a crucible, refining consciousness, bending mind and body into instruments capable of enduring, of perceiving beyond ordinary comprehension, of submitting to laws that were written not on paper, but in air, metal, ash, and memory. Every step forward, every brush of hand against wall or sarcophagus, carried the weight of countless presences, both living and dead, and travelers understood with an immediacy that was physical and psychic that they were no longer merely visitors. They were components of the place, extensions of its consciousness, bearers of its smoke, ash, shadow, and memory, shaped irrevocably, their identities dissolved into the corridor's endless loops. By the time the seventh night passed, the corridors had folded the travelers into their rhythm so completely that even waking brought no relief. The desert outside remained a dim concept, distant and ungraspable, and the hallways persisted, embedded in thought, muscle, and breath. Dreams, movements, and memories had converged into a singular continuum, a suspended existence where self and smoke, ash and shadow, body and building were inseparable. Each step carried the echo of innumerable eyes. Each breath resonated with histories unseen. Each gesture traced the invisible script of the corridor's design, and the travelers, stripped of certainty, walked on, aware that there was no exit, only continuation, transformation, and the slow, deliberate accumulation of presence into the eternal, smoke-filled hall. The desert outside no longer existed, though its memory lingered in the faint grit that clung to hair and clothing, a ghostly residue of wind and sun, a distant echo swallowed by the corridors that had claimed the travelers entirely. Sandstorms passed, rolling across the dunes with muted fury, yet no sound reached those within, no vibration touched their awareness, for the building had absorbed every threshold of perception, creating an impermeable chamber where the air itself dictated the measure of existence. Travelers moved with deliberate slowness, bodies calibrated by ash, smoke, and shadow, each limb aligned with patterns they could no longer name, each step guided by the invisible architecture of attention and observation. Souls wavered like heat above coals, shimmering and unstable, flickering between body and ash, hovering on the edges of perception, neither fully anchored to flesh nor entirely released into the ether, a liminal state cultivated meticulously by the master whose patience had no limit. Eyes, once bright with curiosity or fatigue, dulled into polished obsidian, reflecting nothing but the corridor's curves, the bronze sarcophagi, and the smoke that moved with the precision of a living organism. The mirrors, warped and blackened, no longer displayed reflection but echo, replaying movements a moment delayed, overlaying gestures with the weight of histories uncounted, of deaths catalogued, of presences absorbed into the hall. Lips moved involuntarily, shaping words that belonged neither to travelers nor to time, syllables carried along by currents of ash and smoke, echoing faintly against walls that remembered every vibration, every whisper, every beat of pulse that had passed across their thresholds. The master's silhouette remained a constant, shifting only in scale and proximity as he passed between sarcophagi, hands coated with soot and residue that seemed to absorb life from touch and exhale inevitability. He inhaled the thick, viscous smoke as though it were sustenance, as though each breath drew the corridors and their inhabitants into alignment with a rhythm that had existed since the construction of the place, a rhythm older than memory, older than sand, older than the first caravans that had traced the desert lines into the horizon. The smoke itself had become a medium of transformation, carrying the imprint of every soul that had entered before, recording compliance, endurance, resistance, and despair, folding them into patterns perceptible only to the master and the corridors themselves. Travelers' senses were saturated. Inhalation and exhalation no longer simply served survival, but registered intention, feeding into the furnace that the building had become, a crucible where consciousness was measured, reshaped, and released only to be bound anew. Time had ceased to flow. Days, nights, hours, and moments merged into a continuum of sensation. Ash drifted in dense currents, brushing against skin with tactile insistence, embedding itself in pores, in hair, in the hollows behind ears, a slow and deliberate pressure that taught attention, endurance, and obedience. Shadows no longer belonged to walls or objects, but to perception itself, coiling in corridors, curling along ceilings, pooling at feet, extending and retracting with the subtle intelligence of a mind that belonged to the building as much as to the master who orchestrated it. The corridors had become alive, a sentient lattice of air, smoke, ash, and bronze, capable of registering intent, cataloging movement, and shaping response without a single gesture from the travelers themselves. Laughter, grotesque and distorted, emerged at intervals, existing outside causality, resonating in ribcages, vibrating along spines, teaching the travelers to differentiate rhythm from origin, terror from necessity, imprinting lessons on perception without explanation. Mirrors, now more numerous than travelers could count, replayed their gestures with slight delay, overlays of presence interwoven with shadows, ghostly traces of hands that had traced walls decades earlier, of mouths that had formed silent words centuries ago, of lives and deaths compressed into the metal's memory. Travelers no longer knew which motions were their own, which impulses were theirs, which breaths signaled volition, and which merely responded to the subtle commands of air, shadow, and ash. Every movement became ritualized, every step a negotiation with forces unseen but omnipresent, every inhale and exhale an act of compliance with the corridor's invisible laws. Souls flickered like lanterns in windless nights, tethered to bodies that had been hollowed of autonomy, reshaped into vessels capable of endurance, compliance, and submission. Hands became instruments of unseen ritual, fingers tracing lines that the corridors themselves demanded, mapping geometries that only the building understood, lines that intersected with the pulse of the master, the rhythm of the smoke, the weight of ash, and the resonance of shadow. Travelers learned, gradually, that resistance was absorbed, redirected, neutralized. That struggle expended itself in the medium of the corridors, leaving only efficiency, only rhythm, only endurance in its wake. Eyes dulled further, pupils fixed in stares that took in all without perception, reflecting the corridor's intent back into themselves, reinforcing transformation, reinforcing submission, reinforcing the invisible chains that had replaced identity with function. By the time the sun might have risen outside, should anyone have observed it, the corridors had completed the first stage of transmutation. Travelers moved as extensions of the building, gestures perfectly aligned with ash and smoke, with shadow and mirror, with bronze and memory. The master walked among them, inhaling, exhaling, measuring each pulse, each gesture, each inhalation, each trace of resistance and compliance. Souls, flickering and unstable, now hovered closer to form, tethered securely by the invisible architecture of observation, awareness, and compulsion. The furnace of consciousness burned steadily, not in fire but in perception, shaping what remained into obedience, hollow semblance, and endurance without question. Every footstep, every brush of hand, every subtle turn of head carried the mark of the corridor's invisible logic, a meticulous record of transformation that was precise, cruel, and invisible. Travelers were no longer wholly themselves. They had become components of the master's design, instruments in a symphony of smoke, ash, shadow, and bronze. Their autonomy surrendered to the slow, unyielding insistence of the hall that had consumed the desert and all who entered it, leaving only the hushed rhythm of bodies, breath, and flickering souls, calibrated to endure, obey, and exist without self, tethered forever to the furnace that had become their world. When the travelers finally emerged, months or years later, no one could say with certainty. The sun above the desert no longer bled gold across the dunes, but hung in the sky as an unnatural gray, thick and oppressive, as if the atmosphere itself had absorbed the corridor's ash and shadow and exhaled it back in a suffocating haze. Their bodies moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm, limbs guided by forces they no longer recognized, eyes empty, glassy, reflecting nothing of the world beyond the dunes, mouths opening and closing in the semblance of speech, but swallowing the sound before it could escape, leaving their voices trapped, swallowed by their own throats. Every inhalation carried the faint, metallic tang of iron, a residue not merely of blood but of smoke, memory, and transformation, clinging to tongue, teeth, and nasal passages, refusing to dissipate, a permanent signature of the Caravanserai's work. Travelers stepped through sand as though it were an extension of the corridors, each footprint a record of the endurance imposed upon them, echoing faintly only in the consciousness of those who walked behind, a rhythm of absence and presence intertwined, inescapable, immutable. The desert around them seemed altered, stripped of ordinary reference points. Dunes rolled like molten ash, wind whispering in a cadence that mimicked their hollowed breaths, carrying, impossibly, the laughter of corridors, warped and distorted, as if the building itself had extended its presence beyond walls and sarcophagi into the open world. Travelers sensed the gaze of invisible eyes everywhere, in the pale light, in the shifting sand, in the curling smoke that seemed to rise from their own bodies, a subtle, constant pressure that reminded them of the corridor's claim. Shadows fell unnaturally long, folding over bodies as though drawn by the corridor's geometry, following each step in precise alignment with internal rhythms they no longer fully controlled, pulses echoing in time with the hidden fires that had burned within them. Memories returned only as fragments, refracted through smoke and ash, sharp edges that cut and reshaped understanding, leaving the mind both aware and vacant. They recalled names that were not theirs, moments of horror witnessed through the senses of others, and gestures that had been commanded and now replayed involuntarily, hands forming shapes in the air that meant nothing outside the corridors, yet felt irrevocably necessary. Mirrors carried in caravans reflected empty faces with hollow eyes, lips twitching in the faint remnants of unspoken words, echoing the mutterings once forced by the corridor's invisible intelligence. Each traveler sensed the presence of the master, though he had never appeared, felt the meticulous observation that had shaped them, and understood that what remained was not merely memory but enduring, unescapable imprint, a fusion of smoke, shadow, ash, and obedience embedded in flesh and spirit alike. Some travelers claimed they heard laughter carried by the wind, voices unmistakably their own, distorted and multiplied, as though the corridors had followed them into the dunes, inscribing new echoes into the fabric of air. The scent of iron lingered in their breath, subtle but persistent, a silent reminder of fires endured, of consciousness forged and recalibrated in ways the body understood but the mind could not articulate. Fingers brushed against one another, feeling the pulse of residual ash, tracking patterns invisible to all but themselves, tracing the same motions once required in the narrow, smoke-filled halls, gestures rendered ritualistic, precise, inevitable. No human structure could be seen, yet the memory of walls, sarcophagi, mirrors, and corridors remained vivid, insistent, a private architecture that followed each traveler wherever the dunes led. Each step through sand felt both tentative and commanded, the desert transformed into an extension of the Caravanserai's reach, a space where ash and shadow dictated rhythm, where breath and pulse carried meaning beyond perception, where the line between self and environment had dissolved entirely. Travelers no longer felt the need for food, water, or shelter. The corridors had impressed upon them endurance beyond necessity, a hollow sustenance drawn from smoke, memory, and the silent architecture that now lived within them. When night fell, darkness brought no relief. Stars were dim, distant, and fractured, as if obscured by ash that had traveled with the travelers, dusting the sky with the residue of transformed consciousness. Shadows curled around limbs, coiling with a slow, deliberate intelligence, carrying the corridor's presence into tents and campsites, into movements attempted but always guided by unseen hands. Travelers felt, in the pulse behind their eyes, in the twitch of fingers, in the slight cadence of step, the corridor's insistence that obedience and endurance were permanent conditions, not lessons to be forgotten, but laws to be enacted indefinitely. Those who attempted to speak found voices swallowed before they formed, leaving words trapped, gesturing for comprehension that would never come, leaving gestures and expressions as proxies for communication. Some moved as though the corridors still guided their path, hands tracing invisible lines in the sand, shadows stretching to accommodate motions learned and enforced in smoke-filled halls. Others paused, staring at dunes as though awaiting some sign, some cue, yet understanding deep within that the Caravanserai's fire had traveled with them, that the smoke was embedded not in the desert, but in their blood, lungs, and sinews, unshakable, permanent, and inescapable. The Caravanserai itself remained buried, lost beneath dunes, a ruin swallowed by sand and time, yet its essence endured. Every traveler carried within the smoke and ash, the shadow and mirrors, the forced rhythm of limbs and pulse, the hollowed echo of self. Life outside was now a corridor in miniature, the world folded into the architecture of transformation they had endured. Sunlight could not burn it away, wind could not disperse it, and death could not sever the tether. The corridors had left no walls, no sarcophagi, no smoke to see, but they had left presence, embedded, insidious, an eternal echo that would follow, shaping breath, movement, thought, and spirit until the last spark of life, until memory itself was consumed by the smoke that would never leave, not in life, not in death.